Welcome back to the Reflection Podcast. I'm Ed Blonski from St. Matthew Lutheran Church. That's where the podcast Reflection comes from. And after today's show, I will give you some information on how you can contact us, get in touch with us here at St. Matthew, and either online or in person. Do really appreciate you tuning into today's episode of the podcast. Thinking about these things, that the Christian church, of which I am a member, needs to take seriously what it means to be the church, and we need to be serious about being the church 24/7. So let's find out who's in the pastor's office today to talk about that and more on this episode of the Reflection Podcast. Joining me in the pastor's office today, Dr. Joel Biermann, a teacher in the Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod at Concordia Seminary. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Biermann.
My pleasure.
Awesome. So let's get right into it. I'd like you to tell us about you. I think probably the only other person that might be able to tell us about you would be your mother, and that would know best, but she's not here, so I'm going to have you introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got to this point in your career.
Well, I've been teaching here at the seminary for 22 years, I guess, something like that. Before that, I was a parish pastor in Nebraska and Michigan and enjoyed that a great deal. Spent about 11 years in the parish. And then before that, I did my college at Concordia, Ann Arbor, where I met my wife. And we've been married now for 35 plus years, almost, something like that. No, let me think. Actually 39 years this May. So time is flying by. We have 3 kids, 10 grandkids. Number 11 will be born in June. They all live here in the St. Louis area, so that's a great delight. I was raised in a parsonage. My dad's a pastor, and so a PK. My wife is a PK as well, so we've got a heritage going back for a little bit. My son is a pastor, my brother is a pastor, and so there's a little bit of heritage there, and my brother-in-law is a pastor. So we have that kind of heritage, I suppose. I enjoy teaching very much. I teach in the Department of Systematic Theology, which I like a lot, and love to get people interested in doctrine and seeing the relevance of doctrine for real life. So that's kind of me.
So it almost sounds like you're single-handedly keeping the Missouri Synod full of pastors.
Well, I don't know about single-handedly, but we're doing what we can, doing our small part.
Keep up the good work, because we
Yeah.
need the help, believe me. So explain to our listeners what systematics is.
Yeah, that's always a great question. Systematic theology is one of the 4 branches of theology that is traditionally divided up at the seminary. And that division only is 150, a couple of hundred years old. It was actually Schleiermacher who made it up. But we divide theology between exegetical, which is reading the Bible, historical, which is what is the church taught, practical, which is preaching, teaching, actually conveying the faith. Then that leaves systematic theology. And systematic theology is where we try to systematize the teachings of the church, the doctrine. So in a sense, systematic theology is what you do in catechism class. And so I'll tell people that what I do is like catechism class bumped up a few degrees maybe.
So what classes do you teach right now at the seminary? How would you drill down on the systematics?
Yeah, well, right now I'm teaching nothing. It's January term, and I'm not teaching anything in January quarter, but that's good. In the spring semester, I'll be teaching a class for second-year students, which we call Church and World, which explores the relationship of the church to the world around, and it's a required course in the second of our systematic sequence in the second year. And then I'll also be teaching a couple of electives. I'm teaching a course called Man and Woman in Creation, and we look at God's plan for male and female. And then in the second half of the semester, I'll be teaching a class called Civil Affairs, looking again about how the church acts with the world around us in the temporal kind of realm. I'm doing a couple of grad courses in the spring. I'll be doing a course called Work and Art, where I explore with PhD students the interface between vocation and beauty and how these things play out. And I'm also teaching a class called Civic Affairs. So I have a great interest in contemporary ethics, especially relationship to the world around us, virtue ethics, formation, habituation. That's kind of my stuff.
That sounds like it would be completely relevant today.
I think so.
Yeah, with male and female, the gender
Yeah,
issue that is out there, and how the church can speak to that. And
right.
I'll ask you this question: should the church speak to that?
The church has to. I mean, the church speaks to that by equipping her own people. I think it's helpful to remember, thinking about the three estates. We have the home, then we have the church, then we have the world around. The government and our responsibilities there. And it's important to remember that God's truth is simply God's truth. We need to teach it. We need to teach it at home to our families. We need to teach it in the church, and then we need to tell it to the world. They don't want to listen. They don't really care. They're not going to be that excited about what we have to share, but we share it anyway because it's God's truth. And so I think that's how I look at it is, it's not so much that we want to go out and, change the world, fight for the right legislation, or, try to get our way in the world. It's a matter of, this is God's truth. You need to pay attention to it. And so we speak it, and we try to do it in a voice that is winsome and compelling, not necessarily strident, but we have to speak it.
I talked in the last season of this podcast with Greg Seltz, and that's obviously very near and dear to his heart as he works in Washington, D.C., speaking for the church, advocating for the church to government. Why do you do this? What brought you to this point of teaching future pastors?
Yeah, I was raised in a parsonage and always kind of figured I'd be a pastor. I just kind of knew it would happen. And so it's not really, I never had the lightning bolt. I never had the voice. I never had anybody say, you should do this. I just kind of figured this is what I'll do. And so I went to Concordia, Ann Arbor, did study Greek, and then did history poli-sci, double major. And you don't do much with that besides go to the seminary. And so came to the seminary, got a call, and so I was a pastor. And I loved serving this way. I love using the gifts God has given me to bring God's truth to people, to bring God's grace, to bring the gospel. I really enjoy teaching. And when I was in the parish, I was told often, you should be doing more teaching. You should be teaching at a higher level. And so I heard that a few times. Then I heard it from a few people who I really respected. And a couple of doctors in the church said I should be doing that. So I thought, I guess I better pay attention. So that prompted me to actually leave my parish and come back to the seminary full time back in 1998 and work on the PhD. And then I finished my degree and started teaching at the Sem, got a call within a few weeks of finishing my degree, and I've been doing it ever since. So I teach because I love God's truth. I want people to know it. I want people to live it. I'm absolutely convinced that life goes better when you do it God's way, and that means you need to know doctrine. So
what's your favorite class to teach?
Oh, that's hard. I like a lot of them. I have a few unfavorites, but things you've got to do. But I love teaching anything live in the classroom when I've written the syllabus. I love teaching that. I have a class I just wrapped up last semester called Ethics in Human Care. Enjoy teaching that a great deal. I love teaching my work and art course. I love teaching a new course I've got called Vocation and Work, which is for MDiv students. I like to teach pretty much everything.
That work in art class intrigues me.
Yeah.
What kind of, unpack that one a little bit. What kind of art are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about art, fine arts. We're talking about music. We're talking about visual arts. We're talking about literature. And the notion here is that God works in the world in very direct ways. And we think immediately of Bible, special revelation. But see, he also works the general revelation. It's his creation. So God speaks through all kinds of things. Historically, the philosophers and even the church fathers all through the Middle Ages put a high premium on what they call the three transcendentals: truth, goodness, and beauty. And they recognize that truth comes from God, and God speaks truth, and it fills the world and is simply what is right, what is real. And the good is the right behavior, the right ways of doing things. This is also a pervasive transcendental. And then so is beauty, the sense of the fittingness, the sense of something that pulls you outside of yourself and helps you realize there's something more to this reality. and just to delight is kind of the key word. And so what's interesting to me is, as Lutherans, truth, we're kind of big on that. We really own truth. We love our Book of Concord, love our doctrinal veracity. Truth is a big deal. Goodness we'll tolerate. We put up with ethics. Ethics has its place, but it's works. Righteousness is always a problem. So we put up with that. But beauty, we don't pay much attention to. And I think that's a shortcoming. Interestingly, in the church these days, there's increasing attention being paid to aesthetics and beauty, which is great and way over time. Now, I couple that with work, because work is also one of those things where you think about, what's the big deal? But theologically, it's just loaded. It's really a rich, complicated, interesting topic to think about. Is work part of the curse, something we get away from? Is work just a means to surviving, or is work part of our very human nature? Are we built to work? And if that's the case, that has a whole different set of implications. And so it's a fascinating topic to dig into.
I seem to remember work was there before the fall into sin, if I'm not mistaken.
You're exactly right. And this is one of the things I drive at. I would argue that work is part of our human reality, and that God has built us as humans to work, which puts a whole new light on things like retirement and on even the eschatological fulfillment, what we can expect to be doing at the resurrection. Things starts to shift.
I wonder where we happen to, particularly Lutherans, but there are non-Lutherans that also listen to this podcast. But where did we lose the art aspect? I mean, Martin Luther, 500 years ago, he wrote poetry, and many of it was put to music.
Oh, yeah.
Where did we lose that?
No, and Luther loved music, playing his lute, and he just loved it. So yeah, the church has a long history, and in the Middle Ages up to the Renaissance, who were the patron of the arts? It was the church. Art was the church's product. We did it, and the church did it better than anybody, and everybody knew it. And so part of this got lost with the rise of the Enlightenment. And so in the 17th century into the 18th, you have increasingly this, focus on an anthropocentric rather than a theocentric way of looking at the world. And so as man became the center of everything and the focus of everything, this becomes increasingly applied to all of life. And so then art becomes human expression, a way of expressing ourselves. And then you have the idea of art for its own sake, and then that it's just a matter of taste, and it's pretty subjective. And so you start losing the connection of art to the transcendental reality that puts you into touch with God himself. And so art at that point becomes increasingly as kind of a self-centered endeavor of whatever you feel like, and not a sense of conversation with or interaction with the reality of God himself. And that's how the ancients saw it, and that's how the Middle Ages saw it. And I think the reason the church has become wary of art and even a little bit uncharitable towards art is because of that strong turn away from the art as a practice of the church and as just a practice of the Enlightenment. I think that was where things really went divergent there.
Back in the day when I was at the seminary, so this would be late 80s, early 90s, one of my favorite classes, and the one that I still use today, I mean, I use all my theology classes, of course, and
Sure.
I wasn't so great at Hebrew, better at Greek, but the one class that I use every single day, every weekend and week out, was a class that was taught by Francis Rosso, who's retired now, unfortunately, because the man is a treasure for the church, literature and the gospel. And he taught us that God speaks even through, or echoes of the gospel come through art.
Yep. I learned a ton from Rev Rosso. He's still around on occasion. He shows up on campus, and he's awesome. I have high regard for Francis. He taught me a lot. And his very attitude toward the sense of literature all conveying the ultimate story. This is one of C.S. Lewis's moves. It's right on the money. And so Rev had a huge influence on me as well.
When we are talking about, especially the Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod, but this is church-wide, Holy Christian Church-wide, we're low on workers. We need more men and women to go into church work, men to go into the pastoral ministry. And I know that that's a high priority for the seminaries, to get as many guys to go as possible, and also women to go into the deaconess program and into the teaching ministry and things like that. What do you think, when you're dealing with the formation of pastors, most especially, what is that? What is the most important class for them that they're going to be needing? I mean, it's hard to say. I know it's subjective, but
Sure.
from your perspective.
I don't know if I could boil it down to a single class. To me, the critical thing is the overall formation that happens. One of the things that we're doing, I think, better than we have in a long time here at the SEM is thinking about the whole process of education. It's not just data dump and getting ideas into your head, but it's actually forming somebody to be a servant for the church and somebody capable of doing what needs to be done for the sake of the proclamation of the gospel and the formation of God's people. And so we think hard about formation. So I would say, I just heard this from fourth year guys as they were wrapping up my class last semester, that, they can see the change happening themselves. They see how they've progressed from their first year and how the ideas they're hearing now would have been like, whoa, I can't handle it. But now they see how it all fits and all hangs together. And so for us, especially in my department, in my systematics department, we have crafted our entire systematic sequence very deliberately. And each course is carefully structured. And so we have 5 required courses, and they're all built on each other. So that by the time you finish that 5th one, it all kind of comes together. And like you say, I see it now. It all hangs together. And so it's really hard to pull one out and say, there's the critical one. They all need each other.
So let's talk about you personally in your ministry, either pastoral or even in the teaching ministry. Things that you expected when you got into this, and maybe some of the things that took you by surprise.
Yeah, I grew up in a parsonage, and so I watched, and my dad worked at home most of the time, and so I was pretty involved. He used to drag us along on shut-in visits and hospital calls and stuff, and so I had a pretty good idea of what to expect, and I don't think I was too shocked or surprised by things. Probably I was aware of this, but just to see it in action is and this also being in the ministry for many years, is how people just can be kind of rather ridiculous in the things they'll do. And they know better and they don't do it. And you'll tell them point blank. I remember as a pastor more than once telling people, you should do this. And they, you think so? Yeah, I know so. You should do this. This is your course of action. I'll see. Then a few months later, I didn't do it. Things aren't good. Yeah, I know. And it's just, and to be blunt in the stupidity of people. It's a harsh word, and we're all this way. We just do dumb things. Sin is just dumb. And the depth of our fallenness is pretty deep. And when you see that in the pastoral office, you see stuff in reality that people think you're making up. It's real. Real life far exceeds the stuff you see on TV. It's just stuff that's going on all the time with real people. It's just the depths of sin they're pretty deep. And so that was probably the most noteworthy thing I probably took out of my parish experience, was that, as Dr. Hummel used to say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And so people aren't that different. They just stay the same, no matter how much you learn or what's going on. So then that's a huge warning to us. And I've learned to really put stock into there, but by the grace of God go I own that and believe that's really true. And we need to all be very aware of that. But then it also gives you hope for what God can do in his gospel. And so that's probably the biggest thing I would take away, I suppose.
In the 21st century, we are now 2,000 years since Jesus walked the earth and started the church. And we are miles and light years away from that technology-wise as well. But do you see that maybe the church's mission hasn't changed all that much in the particulars? What is the same as it was 2,000 years ago, but also what are the new challenges that the church is facing?
No, that's a great question. And I think the key here is to recognize that, as I've said, people are the same. And people do not fundamentally change. And I get, frankly, a little annoyed when I hear people talking about the church needs to rethink its mission strategy. No, we do what we always do. We tell people that they're sinners, that they are messed up, and that they're not going to ever get their life squared away until they find the reality in Christ. That is always the same. We have one gospel everywhere for all time. It's not a European gospel. It's not an American gospel. It's not a Western gospel. It is the gospel for all people in all places, all time. And we shouldn't be ashamed of that. We need to stop backing off of that. Does everybody need to repent? Yes. Is Christ the only way of salvation? Yes. Is that nice? I don't care. It's true. And so we need to say that with confidence. And so that's the mission. It's always the same. Now, having said that, the challenges and the way that people think vary radically through time. And so people today aren't thinking the way they were thinking in Luther's day. They don't have the same concerns, the same motivations, the same drivers. They don't have the same community connections. That's different. And the people in Luther's day were very different from the people in Paul's day. And in fact, in many ways, we're closer now to Paul's day than we are to Luther's day, because we have a very pluralistic culture where Christianity is no longer in the predominant majority situation. That's closer to Paul's time than ours. But we're different than Paul, because Paul's Christianity was a brand new thing no one had ever heard of. We're speaking a Christian message in a world that thinks they know it inside and out, but don't, and have been, in some people have put this way, they have been inoculated against the gospel. And I think there's some truth to that. So we have our own challenges, but the message stays the same. It doesn't need to be repackaged, doesn't need to be reformulated, it doesn't need to be re-aimed. It just needs to be spoken in a way that is paying attention to where people are and what's going on. So that's why I spend so much time thinking about the culture, and we spend so much time with the world around us. You've got to pay attention to what's going on, because our day is not like Pieper's. Our day is not even like it was 40, 50 years ago when you and I were at the Summit. It's different. And we need to pay attention to what the needs are and what's going on, what people are thinking. And so we think about the best way to bring the gospel to that situation.
You mentioned Pieper. Just to let people know, Francis Pieper was a president at the seminary at the beginning of the 20th century, and he wrote the predominant dogmatic text for the Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod.
Right.
And yeah, I wonder how much really has changed. I mean, you talk about Paul's gospel was new and different, was completely different from what anybody had ever heard before. It almost seems like today it's the same thing. People just don't know the gospel. Right. And lifelong Lutherans, we fall into that trap that, oh, everybody knows what we're talking about. I don't think anybody knows what we're talking about, even people in the church.
No, I'd agree.
Something new.
I'd agree. You meet people and you ask them about the church, and they assume that, okay, you got to be good, you got to go to church, you can't be nice. And they have a standard works scenario worked out for what Christianity is, and they have no concept of what salvation in Christ actually means. They don't understand the gospel.
So last year, where I serve as a pastor, we were able to get a candidate that graduated from the seminary. We were blessed because there just wasn't that many to go around. And now as a circuit visitor, I oversee about 7 churches here in my circuit as a pastor as well. And we have 2 churches, 3 churches that are vacant. One of them is now applied for a candidate as well. And so one of the reasons I started this podcast was because, hey, my church needs to get more church workers in it. What can the church, it could be the Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod or even the One Holy Christian and Apostolic Church, as a people, what can we do to raise up another generation of leaders that will reflect God to this world?
Right. I'm going to lean heavily on this whole idea of habituation, formation, forming people and shaping people to actually follow Christ. I'm persuaded that when you teach people the fullness of the Christian message, it becomes completely all-consuming. This is how Christ intended it. It's not a religion to give you a spiritual dimension to your life. It is the definition of your life. It shapes you, it forms you, it guides you. When we take that seriously and encourage people to raise their kids that way, families to function that way, with the church at the center of their lives instead of the church as an important facet of their lives. No, the church is what defines and directs your life. When we teach people that, and they start doing that in their families and raising their kids that way, their kids grow up thinking, how am I going to serve with my life? What am I going to do? And one of the questions they'll ask is, maybe I should be a pastor, maybe I should be a teacher, a deaconess, because that's forefront of their thinking. They've already been groomed to be thinking this way. That's good. That's the best way to habituate them, is you teach them from the time they're a little kid, you should think about being a pastor. Someday maybe you'll do this. And like, even for myself, my dad never told me you'll be a pastor someday, or you should. Never was said, never happened. But I just knew that's what was going to happen because of how I was being raised and the assumptions and the consistency with how things were done. That's the best way to get this thing to happen. And recruitment, I believe, happens when the children are in their preschool years. That's when it begins. And then it's all the way through. So it's a long process, but it's one that we need to all own by taking seriously our own following of Christ, and it's our assumption that everybody else should be doing this as well.
I'm glad that the church has, our church, the Missouri Synod, the Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod has the National Lutheran Youth Gathering and Lutheran Youth Fellowship, but also Higher Things is another aspect of this, of reaching early on, getting these kids early on to know that this is, but it starts in the home, as you said. It's just so important. And that's why my current congregation, my present congregation, is really kind of leaning now, going full blown into family ministry. How do we help not only just youth, but how do we help young parents raise children in the 21st century? And so vitally important.
Yes, it is.
So when you look back over your life, as we talk about this with parents raising up children in the church, who was a mentor to you, or several? I'm sure there were several throughout the seasons of your life, but that helps people understand, and maybe they look for those in their lives, that they already have a mentor, they just never thought of it. Who was that people for you?
Yeah, well, my parents obviously were huge. My dad being a pastor, my mom being absolutely committed to following God's way of doing things and being very consistent. The humility that they both evidenced taught me a lot, so they were huge. Then there were always favorite profs you have, at college and at the SEM, who made a big impact, and you just begin to realize these are people who take seriously what it means to follow Christ and really own this. Dr. Nagel made a huge impression. In most people, he made a huge impression, and so. I was one of those who was impressed by him and had that impact. Dr. Rossau had, there are many who I'd say there's evident, teaching there. You see this. My father, I mentioned, my father-in-law had a huge influence. My wife's father, who was a pastor, his commitment, his way of doing things, the way he just told it like it was, huge influence.
We have the same names in our quiver there: Dr. Nagel, sure. Dr. Rossau, Dr. Schmelder for me, Bill Schmelder, back in the day. Very, very important to me as well. So as you form these future pastors, that some of them in the next 12 months are going to be out in the parish now, what's boiled down to me, your mission statement, your philosophy, if we were to, that you would want people, that you can put it on your door, put it on a billboard, what would that be?
Yeah, it would be take seriously what it means to be the church. And you, as a pastor, you better be living this, and in your own family living this. You take seriously what it means to be a husband and father to your kids, and you're actually emulating what it means to follow Christ in your own life, and then showing by example what it means for other people to do that. You need to be the example setter. So that's the critical thing. And then congregations need to look like this as well. Congregations are not places to come and get a spiritual shot for the week. Churches are not a place to come and get a little Jesus in your life. Congregations are not a place to make sure your kids know some morality. The church is the living body of Christ in the world. We are the witness to the world. This is where we form people, we form each other into what it means to follow Christ. We hold each other accountable to that, and we show the world what it looks like to do this and invite the world into participation in this. We take this seriously. And so I guess my huge thing is, let's have the church be thoroughly the church, which is a bold community, different than the world, in the world, interacting with the world for the sake of the world, not at war with the world, not at enmity of the world, but living in the world for the sake of the world, and yet utterly different than the world. And that's what I want my students to have, that understanding of, I'm bringing Christ to people, and I'm living this reality so that more people can have the joy of living in God's plans.
So what are you reading these days? And what would you want to give someone to read? If you could give 3 books away, this is what you want to put in their hands.
Yeah, I try to read all the time. I've got a stack, and I'm looking at it, the books I need to read. I buy them and I have to get around to them eventually. I've been doing a fair amount of reading lately because I'm between semesters now. So what I'm reading lately isn't what I tell everybody else to read, though, necessarily. Sometimes I read a book and it's like a dog. So it's just, don't bother. But the books I really encourage people to look at, one of my favorites, most influential for me, was a book by Adolf Koberle. And he wrote a book called The Quest for Holiness. At least that's the translation in English. And in German, it was Justification and Sanctification. But in English, it came in as Quest for Holiness. And Koberle's book was written in the mid-20th century, and it's not the easiest read, but he does a really wonderful job of just laying out the full reality that God does absolutely everything in saving us and in sanctifying us. And then he couples that with, and it is absolutely your responsibility not ever to mess it up. You better make sure you're following Christ and taking seriously sin and taking seriously the walk of Christ. And he melds both of those things together in such a powerful way. You can't accuse him of being works righteousness, nor accuse him of being a gospel reductionist. He's got them both full blast. So I love that book. And it made a huge influence on me when I read through it. And I still anchor in that book a lot, in a lot of ways. That's a huge one for me. I've also become a real fan of a German Roman Catholic moral theologian named Josef Pieper, no relation to Franz Pieper. And Josef Pieper was also mid-20th century. And he wrote a lot on Thomistic kind of stuff, and a lot on virtue, and a lot on the arts, and a lot on this idea of kind of an Aristotelian understanding of reality, the transcendentals. And so he's got a book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture, which has been very influential in my thinking, and has helped me and think through a lot of different things. So I'm quite fond of that one as well, as a Josef Pieper, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. So those are two right up there. Thinking who else I would put on that list. And probably I'd throw Gustaf Wingren on there, Lutheran Vocation. Really good text, which is fortunately has been, I think, getting the recognition it deserves in our church body. Gene Edward Veith has done a lot of work on vocation, which is good, and people are paying a little more attention to that now. When you and I were students, I don't think it was talked about very much at all. So I think in the last 40 years or so, that's really been rectified a lot, and I'm grateful for that. But I think Wingren's book is still really helpful that way. So those are three.
It helped me because Dr. Veith taught at Concordia, Mequon, when I was a student there. So I caught that, and then when I got to the seminary, I found Lutheran Vocation in the bookstore, and I don't know that I ever bought it for a class, but I bought it.
Yeah.
And then I've read it, and then it's no longer on my bookshelf because I gave it away.
Yeah.
So
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, I end up doing that with a lot of my books. You got to read this, you got to read this, and then I never get them back. So
you have to be careful. Yeah.
Yeah, you do have to be careful. So as we wrap this up, and I really appreciate this, and I know I'm going to want to get you back to talk about some specific things too,
Sure.
At a later date. But is there something that maybe you thought I should have asked and I didn't get to? I can give you the last word here.
I don't know, really. I don't have a big axe to grind or big agenda going here. I'll add one more book. I'll do that, and that's Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I've become really fond of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he's also interesting because he was not mentioned when I was a student. In fact, if he was mentioned, it was usually to warn you that he was a bad Lutheran and look out for his works righteousness or something. He was suspect, and so he was admired because he stood up against Hitler, but not his theology. And I admire him for standing up against Hitler, but I also think his theology is really very helpful, very insightful. And I think Bonhoeffer was, frankly, a good Lutheran and not just a, interesting theologian. I think he was very faithful to Luther. So I've become quite fond of his book, Creation and Fall, and also his ethics, and highly recommend those as well.
I have a Bonhoeffer biography on my shelf that's on my list to read by Eric Metaxas, and I haven't.
Take a look at it. I think it's got some. It's worth reading. It's definitely worth reading.
Yeah, it's kind of down below a couple other books, but I've got it there.
Bump it up a little bit. It's worth reading. That biography takes some flack because people think he's a little bit too charitable to Bonhoeffer, makes him too much of an evangelical. But I think, from what I know of Bonhoeffer, that it's a pretty accurate picture. And I think actually Bonhoeffer was a more Christian than people think he was, and much more faithful and much more pious about his faith than people realize. So I think that's a pretty good biography.
I think that it's the one thing about Bonhoeffer that everybody knows, and maybe that shadows or casts a shadow over everything else, was that, he was murdered by the Nazis just
Right.
mere days before liberation. And well, I was going to say it's a shame that he did not live longer, but he lived exactly as long as God wanted him to,
That's right.
and left a legacy as well. Maybe, and it's a legacy I think that, like you said, the church needs to rediscover.
I agree.
With a couple other people as well, I'm sure.
Oh, there's lots.
Dr. Biermann, thank you so much for joining me today. I do appreciate it, and God's blessings to you as you form up the next generation of pastors for us.
I'll do my best. Thank you for the time and the opportunity to talk. It's been a joy.
Boy, did I really enjoy my conversation with Dr. Biermann. And like I said, I'm going to bring him back, I think, to talk about more deeply into what he called systematic theology, or the system of our Christian theology, or if you happen to be a Christian, at least mine, right? I know that not everyone on this podcast is a Christian, at least not yet. I hope that no matter who you are, you will contact us here at St. Matthew to find out more about being a follower of Jesus that we talked about with Dr. Beirmann today. You can contact us at St. Matthew at our website, stmatts.net, stmats.net. We live stream all our worship services, most of our Bible studies, and we have all kinds of other online content for you, devotions and things like that, as well as other podcasts. You can also come in person. We'd love to see you face to face. We are about, an hour northwest of downtown Chicago and only a half hour's drive, depending on the time of day, from O'Hare Airport. So if you happen to find yourself in the Chicagoland area, we'd love to have you come on out. You can come and worship with us on the weekends, and we have things going on during the week as well. Again, you go to our website to plan your visit, stmats.net. This is the Reflection Podcast that we talk with people. I talk with people about reflecting God's love in this dark world. I need you to help me out now. Share this podcast. There's links and there's ways to share it. You can subscribe to it to make sure that you get a notification every time that a new show drops. We are in the midst of season 2 right now, and the season 2 episodes drop on Tuesday mornings, or very early in the morning. So when you get up on Tuesday morning, the show should be there for you. There are 10 episodes in each season, and we're in season 2. And we'd love to have your comments and your rating of us. You can like us or rate us 5 stars, depending on where you get your podcast, and share this across your socials so that other people can hear these wonderful stories and conversations that I am so honored and humbled to have with so many different kinds of people. Thanks for joining me for today, and I pray that God will richly bless you, and I'll see you again on the next episode of the Reflection Podcast.